Here was not an embassy. It was a CIA center. This was a den of espionage, where they were plotting against the Iranian people.
States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
Let's get right to the issue. Can we afford to go to war with Iran? And the answer is no.
This is a memo that describes how we're going to take out 7 countries in 5 years, starting with Iraq and then Syria, Lebanon, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, and finishing off Iran.
Fighters that work with the IRGC Quds Force in Yemen, in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Bahrain.
It will respond. It will respond against the oil. It will respond in the Persian Gulf. It will respond against our troops.
The behavior and the objectives of the regime are not going to change, and therefore the only solution is to change the regime itself. And that's why before 2019, we here will celebrate in Tehran. Thank you very much.
Good morning.
Morning.
Hi, Mr. Bear. How are you?
Hi, good morning.
Hi, good morning. By the way, my brother-in-law is currently working for your former employer. I'm very curious about Iran. I find them rather fascinating, as I do most of the Middle East. I picked up a textbook, basically, it was a series, and read the history of Iran as best I could. It's very complicated, and I noticed that in their history, I was looking for, the Bush administration was constantly saying that they were a threat to virtually everybody, and I couldn't understand. It didn't seem right to me, and so I read this book, and there were moments in history. Now that's history, and today's today. I understand that, but their history of the people, they're very cultured and very intelligent, and they are, they're not a terribly warlike people. They have been under assault by the Russians and the Brits and the Americans and everybody else. And it seems to me that they are the most powerful country in the Middle East, and they have some right to exert their not dominate, but they have their presence. And the one more thing I'll add that I looked up on the website of the Energy Department is that they have a great deal of natural gas, and why they're developing nuclear energy at all is a mystery to me, and I'll just leave you open for some comment, perhaps.
Thanks. Robert Baer, out in Berkeley.
That poses a couple questions for me, and one is, you have to look at, first of all, from the Iranian perspective. It's got 2 American armies on 2 of its borders, Afghanistan and Iraq. In 2003, when we invaded Iraq, we were talking about Iran being part of the axis of evil. The implication was that we might attack Tehran next. So we fed Iranian paranoia at that point. Iran was invaded by Russia in '46. There was the Mossadegh coup in '53. The fact is, I've read the Mossadegh files. We had a limited role in the overthrow of the prime minister in '53. Nonetheless, the Iranians tend to be paranoid about this subject. And they're paranoid right now because we're still talking about bombing Iran. So when you see the Iranians acting irrationally, they do have a reason for it. Now, as for the nuclear energy, what they would like to do, they have a very large population, 70 million. Their oil fields are depleted. A lot of them are. What they would like to do is use that remaining oil to sell on international markets and domestically use nuclear energy. Now, that doesn't mean to say they're not developing a nuclear weapon, which they probably will someday, but there is a reason that they want these nuclear reactors, and it's a very good reason. Now, as far as not opening them up for inspections, what they're saying is, well, if the Israelis don't open up their nuclear facilities, why should we? Now, we would have a ready answer for that because we don't trust you. But, I mean, it's not one that the Iranians can accept. They look at the certain fairness doctrine on their side, and they're saying, you know, fine, if everybody wants to open up their facilities, we will too. It's not going to happen, but that's the dilemma we face as we try to go into negotiations with Iran.
Next call for our guest, Frederick, Maryland. Ibrahim, independent
Hi.
caller. Hi.
Good morning.
Morning.
You know, last week, August 19, was the 56th anniversary of the coup in Iran that removed democratically elected Mohammad Mossadegh as a prime minister. And it was entirely or mostly the job of CIA. Mr. Baer says CIA had only a minor role in it. But my point is, we still talk about something that happened 56 years ago. And most likely we'll be talking about it 56 years from now, because this is a very significant event. It was the greatest calamity that befell Iranian nation. And people in Iran have great resentment about what happened, because at that day, their democracy died. And America to be blamed practically entirely, even though British, of course, were involved.
Let's hear from our guest out in Berkeley, Robert Baer.
Well, I certainly see that point of view. If we go back and look at the record of the Mossadegh coup, which has been published in the New York Times, you'll see that British Petroleum, the British Secret Service, the ambassador, the Shah himself, and even General Schwarzkopf's father, he was in the New Jersey State Police, were part of this coup. So, I mean, we can spread responsibility. But the point is that symbolically, the CIA was behind it. Now, if you're an Iranian and a foreign government comes in and changes your prime minister, who was popular at the time, no doubt about it, was talking about nationalizing oil resources in Iran, it's a humiliation. It's a humiliation not easily forgotten. Just as in 1979, Iran humiliated the United States by holding its diplomats in Tehran. The rescue mission was another humiliation. It was a significant check to American power. It probably contributed to the defeat of Carter in a large sense. So there was two humiliations here. But the Iranians have reason to be paranoid about foreigners, either Russia or the United States or Saudi Arabia. Right now, you have Sunni extremist groups on its edge which are in touch with the American government. And there's one of them called Jundal out of Pakistan, which is setting off car bombs and killing police officers. If you're Tehran in a position, you know, now in a time of volatility, political volatility, you are going to be looking to the outside. And yes, the United States does need to provide quid pro quos for future cooperation. It simply cannot put Iran in the corner and say, do what we want or else. Because on the streets of Tehran, people are still mistrustful of the United States, even the so-called Democrats, the Green Revolution. Mousavi, the former prime minister, is not a friend of the United States. He mistrusts the United States as well. So there's a lot of bad blood to overcome. And yes, the Mossadegh coup is very important for Iranians, and we're going to have, when we go to Tehran one day, and I hope we do, we're going to have to treat Tehran as equals and not as a third world power.
Mossadegh was Iran's 35th prime minister, but his government succeeded in doing what no other Iranian leader was able to do before. He went against British interests in his country and deprived the Navy from securing oil supplies. To understand how important this chapter is in Iran's history and how it shaped its future and its relations with the US, we have to go back to the start of the century, when Iran was still known as Persia. Like many states in the region, Iranian oil wealth was monitored by foreign countries since its discovery. In 1901, the British government encouraged entrepreneur William Knox Darcy to invest in Persia's oil sector. The British brokered a deal between Darcy and the then Shah of Iran, Muzaffar al-Din. Darcy was granted a 60-year concession to prospect, transport and sell petroleum, natural gas, asphalt and minerals in 3/4 of the country. Under the deal, the Shah was given a lump sum of £20,000 in cash and a further £20,000 in shares, with Iran set to receive only 16% of the profits. The Darcy Agreement is known historically as the deal that compromised Iran's ability to benefit from its own oil wealth for decades. In 1908, a significant oil reserve was found at Masjid Suleiman in southwestern Iran. It was the world's largest oil discovery at the time, and it set off a wave of exploration that would change the region's future. After the discovery, the British government bought out the Darcy concession and the Anglo-Persian Oil Company that later became the British Petroleum Company, or BP, in 1954. In the coming era, navies and national economies would be powered by oil, replacing coal. Iranian oil helped the British Navy substantially during World War I. Winston Churchill, who secured the purchase of the shares from the Darcy concession, affirmed the importance of Iranian oil.
Fortune brought us a prize from fairyland beyond our wildest dreams.
For the next 50 years, Iran's vast oil reserves came under British control. That is, until Mossadegh came into power. And in May 1951, the Iranian parliament voted to nationalize the oil industry. Addressing his victory, Mossadegh said in a famous speech,
"Our long years of negotiations with foreign countries have yielded no results thus far. With the oil revenues, we could meet our entire budget and combat poverty, disease, and backwardness among our people."
The nationalization of Iranian oil was a blow to Britain's economic interests and to the survival of the British Empire.
Views of the great refinery at Abadan are sufficient evidence in themselves of its size and importance. This great undertaking, built up over many years by British skill and with British money, has now been evacuated in humiliating circumstances.
Britain took the matter to the International Court of Justice and placed an embargo on Iran's oil industry, making it impossible for Iran to sell its newly nationalized oil on the world market. The British hoped that economic pressure would threaten the popularity of Mossadegh and force him out of power. But Mossadegh was adamant.
Abroad, that strange politician Dr. Mossadegh continued on his strange way, refusing every offer for settlement of the oil dispute.
Desperate to regain control of Iran's oil industry, the British government approached the United States to assist in orchestrating a coup against Mossadegh. Harry Truman's administration rejected the idea of a coup in 1952, but when Dwight Eisenhower came to power in 1953, the British were able to persuade him by warning him of Mossadegh's communist alliances.
Demonstrations and riots in the streets of Tehran have followed the usual pattern in that troubled country. With shouts of "down with the Shah," fanatical leaders have been rallying the people in favor of Dr. Mossadegh.
The initial plan of toppling Mossadegh had failed, but the British and Americans eventually succeeded when they relied on royalists, the supporters of the exiled Shah. The country was divided between the Shah supporters and Mossadegh supporters. This is how pro-Shah demonstrators took over the streets of Tehran. Mobs set pro-Mossadegh newspapers on fire, General Fazollah Zahedi surrounded Mossadegh's residence with tanks, and protesters clashed with his guards. Mossadegh and his cabinet eventually surrendered, and General Fazollah Zahedi became Iran's new prime minister. The US then restored the pro-Western regime of Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to power. This was the first foreign intervention orchestrated by the newly formed CIA. The agency, with the help of British MI6, overthrew the first democratically elected government in the country. It was the beginning of the sequence of events that shaped Iran's relations with the US today.
In the military court at Tehran, where he's been on trial for treason, the Persian ex-premier, Dr. Mossadegh, demonstrates that he knows how to make an entrance.
Mossadegh was imprisoned for 3 years, then put under house arrest until his death. His family were forced to bury him at his residence. The overthrow of Mossadegh transformed Iran from a constitutional monarchy into a royal dictatorship, marking the beginning of public hostility towards the US. In 2000, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright acknowledged for the first time the US's role in the 1953 coup.
But the coup was clearly a setback for Iran's political development, and it is easy to see now why many Iranians continue to resent this intervention by America in their internal affairs.
After the coup of 1953, the oil was back under the control of the British, and the US gave increasing support to the Shah of Iran. In 2013, Iran's parliament approved a bill for the government to sue the US for its involvement in the coup. The bill followed the release of declassified documents offering details about how the CIA carried out the coup as an act of US foreign policy.